Okay, I'm going to try this one more time as a flipped classroom presentation, taking us through chapters 8 to 18. Sticking with chapter 8, Huck calls himself a low-down abolitionist, and this is a reminder of the prevailing belief to which he has been exposed. He has been corrupted, well, not as much as the other boys, Tom, for example, um, but he's been corrupted by society and has been unable to escape a certain amount of contamination, I suppose, or taint in his attitudes towards life. So this is meant to be a name he calls himself. Later in that chapter, the irony here lies in the idea that Jim's central wealth, as it is, I suppose, with every human soul, is his central worth is his freedom. But Jim mourns the loss of money he had, but realizes that in dollars and cents values, he's worth a good deal on the market. And all he wants to do is own himself. So there's a lot of room for commentary in terms of self ownership, autonomy. Do you own yourself? How much you worth? Chapter 9, The House of Death floats by. Well, first, Jim covers up the dead man's face, and he's showing sympathy for Huck, wanting to protect him. Um, and Jim is hiding the identity of the dead man. The identity of the dead man is actually a critical fact that is not revealed until later. Um, and it probably has some influence in terms of Jim's behavior. The chapter also is a reminder that, beautiful and peaceful as the river may seem, it's still a part of nature, and contains destructive elements, especially when man intrudes upon it, as could be symbolized by the floating house of death. There we see Huck and Jim. And the last line of chapter 9 is, "We got home." Huck has accepted the cave on Jackson Island in the middle of the river as his home. He has severed all ties with the past, severed ties with civilization, and begun anew. The cave itself may be interpreted, although this is very psychological, but it could be interpreted as a sort of symbolic womb from which Huck will be reborn. Now, in this chapter, chapter 10, there's a big prank. And the prank that Huck plays on Jim shows Huck's immaturity. And when Jim suffers tremendously, almost dying, Huck feels a lot of guilt, but it's not a very mature sense of guilt. He doesn't take responsibility for it. In fact, he's mostly concerned with hiding the evidence so that he doesn't get caught, so that he's not held responsible for what he has done. Well, Huck returns to town in chapter 11. I suppose Twain is suggesting that civilization exerts a pull. Huck must make periodic returns to the society from which he is escaping in a sense. But actually, though the river symbolizes peace and freedom, it's surrounded on both sides by the world. So, as peaceful and tranquil as the river can be, it's vulnerable to the intrusions by man. Um, Now, when Huck visits Mrs. Loftus, this is, well, hopefully there's some humor in it. It's Huck's first attempt to assume a false identity. Uh, he is a hopeless amateur at trying to impersonate a girl, Sarah Williams, whoever. Mrs. Loftus sees right through him at once, and at this point, so close to home, Huck must disguise himself in fear of discovery. But even later, when he has traveled far enough that his name would be unfamiliar, he does continue to use a false one. It's only on the river with Jim where he can find himself. He has killed himself, quote unquote, in Pap's cabin, and on land he has no identity. But this aspect is reinforced by the final words of chapter 11 as Huck travels in dead silence. Now, at the very end, also, Huck comes back, tells Jim, "Get up and hump yourself. They're after us." Now, the key word there is us because Mr. Loftus is not after Huck. He's only after Jim. And here, Huck, through his language, is revealing that he is aligned his fate with Jim's. Well, Huck, uh, in chapter 12, Huck and Jim leave Jackson Island. There's several pages and descriptions of the tranquility of their existence, their harmony of their existence. There's, uh, I think, a description of them in there just walking around naked, which might strike some as unusual. But this is meant to emphasize there's no division in the river. There's symbolically nothing that separates man, not by color, not by age. Now, as they do set off 5 nights past St. Louis, they do hit a big storm, and they come upon a steamboat with Huck going on the steamboat, of course, and meeting those robbers and killers. Now, chapter 13 is called Honest Loot from the Walter Scott. And the irony here is that Sir Walter Scott, I'm sure you don't know, I only read a little bit from him a long time ago in college, but Sir Walter Scott was a famous 19th century author who wrote of the chivalric code. He wrote of honor and gentility. Um, he was absolutely representative of the most sentimental aspect of the Romantic era. And so Walter Scott is a man whose view of life Twain disdained as sentimental drivel. So the boat named after him is inhabited by cutthroats and thieves and is wrecked. And this seems to be Twain. He can't quite resist poking fun and saying that the Romantic era is done, it is corrupt, and the boulder of realism has smashed it and sunk it. In chapter 14, Jim's attitude towards Solomon. Well, I don't know if you know the story of King Solomon from the Bible is that two women claiming ownership of a single child come to King Solomon asking him to please deliver the child to its rightful owner. King Solomon, in his wisdom, says, "Fine, I will split the child in half, and each of you can have each." Now, the real mother will not allow this, so the real mother says, "No, don't do that." That allows King Solomon to say, "Aha, now I know who the real mother is," and give it to him. But Jim observes the problem in the biblical story completely literally. To him, is this biblical story is a question of human values, and he cannot grasp the cunning of the decision of King Solomon. For at least the way Huck's narration tells it, his mind refuses to look behind the horror of a mutilated child. In this way, Jim is the archetypal father. Uh, his primary worry is that of the helpless infant. He's not distracted by anything else. Later in the chapter, they have a funny conversation about Frenchmen when Huck says "Parlez-vous Francine" or whatever. Now, first, the discussion of royalty is foreshadowing of the appearance later on of two characters named the King and the Duke. Secondly, the fact that Jim fails to see why there should be any differences between people of whatever nationality. Now, this represents Twain's view. Um, to Jim, people are all alike. They share in they're all human beings. Huck has learned enough about worldly matters to know, well, there's different ethnicities, there's different nationalities, and that knowledge has clouded Huck from seeing the deeper understanding that we're all human. Um, Concluding this conversation, Huck decides in disgust that he's wasting his time trying to talk to Jim about this. And at this point, Jim, with his view of humanity as one body, is far superior to Huck in any moral sense, although the narration through Huck's point of view can very much obscure that. Well, death continues to be an important motif in this. The images of death are a reminder that death is a recurring motif, while Huck is without identity. Not till the end of the novel, when Huck becomes himself in truth, do the images of death and the actual occurrences of violent death actually disappear. They'll remain. Well, Um, Huck feels free to tease Jim, and it seems to show his immaturity, perhaps latent racism. That he's white and Jim's black, so he can do that. More importantly, Jim's lecture to Huck. By assuming the right to lecture Huck, Jim is definitely conveying a sense of trust. He would not dare to lecture some other white person who might turn on him. For after all, Jim's freedom is in Huck's hand, and both of them know it. More importantly, the words that Jim says to Huck establish him as a parent figure, scolding a child who has misbehaved, and therefore he's playing the role of Huck's moral guide throughout the remainder of the novel. Oops, there's an illustration of Jim falling asleep at the raft, supposedly dreaming all the fog. Here's a map. We see up at the top Hap's cabin and then Jackson's Island. And when Huck and Jim leave Jackson's Island, they travel down the Mississippi, past where the Missouri River enters, and then 5 nights past St. Louis, they're coming very, very close to Cairo. Cairo is, as it's called, it looks phonetically like Cairo. But Cairo is the place where Jim knows he has to leave the Mississippi River and travel up the Ohio River, for that is the only way to the free states. So, anyone reading the novel has to ask the question, why? Why does Jim stay? And the answers are elusive, but once you put the pieces together, they're crystal clear. Jim knows the identity of who that man was back in the House of Death. Jim knows that Huckleberry Finn is truly an orphan without any parent to look over him. So, although Huck doesn't see it, it reveals so much about Jim that he's willing to defer on his own chance at freedom because he's in the presence of a child that needs his guidance. So Huck encountering the slave traders who say, "Boy, that's a lie." Now, Twain feels, and means the reader to feel, as he's dealing with his conscience, that Jim has every right to his own freedom and his own family. Huck, corrupted by exposure to contemporary society, quote unquote knows, has been taught or conditioned that it's wrong for Jim to act this way. But somehow Huck manages to follow the dictates of his own conscience anyway, rather than the correct morality that society has supposedly taught him. So here Twain is showing the inner rot, not only of the legal and social system, but of religion, which allows and did allow such an inhuman institution as slavery to exist. So for Huck feels he is sinning against everything he's ever been taught by helping Jim. We know he's not sinning. We know this is the bravest measure of his, or the most courageous measure of his conscience. And there's the irony of that. Now, Jim, well, what are his plans? He hopes of working hard and saving money in order to provide a better life for his family. He is, in a sense, following exactly the time-honored Puritan work ethic, of hard work, clean living, and careful goals, which are the foundation of the American way of life, one might say. You know, Irony there, of course, that the American way of life is a way of life which excludes Jim entirely. Now, Huck tells a tall tale. Huck correctly assesses kind of the moral caliber of the men, and used an appropriate lie hinting at his father's smallpox to evade the slave traders. Now, this is the second function of a tall tale, survival. Jim's story of being ridden by the witches brought him prestige, and Twain is later to show how the king and the duke use a tall tale for profit. Here, Huck's using the tall tale for survival. And getting back to the slave hunters one more time, Huck thinks he's lying to the men, but what he says is a literal statement of truth. Huck doesn't want to help Jim escape, but his conscience makes it so he can't help it. His conscience refuses to keep Jim a slave, even if Huck is unconscious to this. Huck doesn't know how much his own true natural conscience is controlling him. In chapter 17, Huck takes another new name. Again, he's without identity. He hasn't established himself as a person. He's going back onto land. He's not Huck, so he makes up the name George Jackson. These false identities are so meaningless to Huck that Twain extracts humor from the situation, forcing Huck to invent a clever little trick to trick Buck into telling him the name that Huck has forgotten. Jackson, Jackson. Colonel Grangerford. Well, Twain sees organized society as entirely hypocritical, and stresses that this unofficial aristocracy has the same values as those in St. Petersburg, Twain's hometown. So the superficial morality hiding inward rot is everywhere, and the fine manners of the Grangerford family and the general air of courtesy and culture are merely coverings of the bloody reality, because the Grangefords and the Shepherdsons kill each other. The irony of the sermon, the preacher is extolling the virtues of brotherly love to a bunch of armed men intent on killing each other. It's ridiculous. It's not only a continuation of Twain's attitude towards society in general, but again, a critique of religion. The church is hypocritical and generally powerless to do good, at least in the case of the Grangefords and the Shepherdsons.